All right, everyone, and welcome back to this next lecture in our course. Here we're dealing finally with how journalists adapt to the new challenges of social media, how they have adapted really since the mid-2000s onwards. So this really now shifts our perspective a little bit from what we've covered so far. What we've done so far is really to look at the way that citizens themselves have, of course, used these new technologies, used the new technologies of Web 2 from the mid 1990s onwards for what I call the first wave of citizen journalism, the emergence of news blogs, of indie media and other platforms. We've looked at the role of Twitter and other forms of social media, particularly in the context of breaking news as well, from the mid to late 2000s. And we've then also looked more broadly at the the more habitual way in which people are now engaging in gatewatching, in news sharing as a demotic practice, as a widespread practice across the population, really across all social media platforms. So we've covered all of these, and then of course we've also most recently looked at how this has been misused ultimately for the spread of what we want to avoid calling fake news, but what is mis and dis and malinformation. So the weaponization of these kinds of practices to spread problematic information. So this is where we've got to so far. We've looked very much at the user perspective, at the citizen perspective of all of these changes over the past couple of decades, and how this has changed how people engage with the news, how everyday people engage with the news. Now the question obviously is, well, what about journalists? They're still around, although their numbers might be thinning compared to the heyday of journalism in the 1970s, but they're still there. The news media is still there. So how have they adopted social media? How have they adapted to the impact of social media and these new practices on their own business? This week, we'll look at individual journalists and how they've come to use social media gradually and reluctantly at times. Next week, we'll be looking at the responses more broadly of the news media industry to the impact of social media. And in fact, the week after that, we'll look specifically at live blogs as a particularly interesting format in all of this, that's sort of trying to connect, trying to combine traditional mainstream media practices with the new logics of social media. And then after that too, we'll be looking at new initiatives, again, specifically responding to mis, dis, and malinformation, to problematic information, by setting up fact-checking and media literacy activities that are meant to counter all of this. That's in week 9. So let's jump right in. And really, I think the first place to start is by saying that ultimately journalism tends to be a fairly almost fearful profession. It tends to be quite afraid of new technologies overall. Now, I could give you all sorts of examples, and I will in a little bit, for how journalists have responded to new digital technologies, to the internet, to social media, and so on. But we can go much further back, in fact. This is a report from The Atlantic that points out that going back to through all New York Times articles, people in the mid-1800s said the telegraph, something as really now basic as the telegraph, was problematic and would ultimately undermine the news because it was, as it says there, too fast for the truth. Now, that sounds quite familiar because it's very much the same thing that has been said about social media and even things like cable TV and satellite TV and so on as well. So the concern to some extent is always when new technologies come along, when new more speedy technologies of transmitting the news come along, almost certainly someone will pop up and say, well, but doesn't that mean we've got less time for verification? We've got less time for sorting fact from mistruth. We may open ourselves up to more misinformation in the process as well. And yeah, as it says there, that certainly sounds very familiar. So this has a very long history. These kinds of claims kind of tend to appear quite frequently when new technologies come along. With some justification, it has to be said, of course, but journalism ultimately tends to adapt in some form, and obviously has very much adopted the telegraph and its successor technologies as critical tools of the trade for rapidly disseminating news updates from around the world to newsrooms around the world as well. But ultimately, journalism is a conservative profession, and it tends to be quite skeptical of these new technologies. So, as I've said, the telegraph itself was a point of concern in the mid-1800s. Even something as simple as automated typesetting was seen as, in some ways, a loss of control, when you no longer had individual people moving literally bits of lead around in order to typeset the pages of the newspaper. Some people were saying, well, that removes a system of checks and balances, because these typesetters, these professional typesetters, might find typos, might find problematic expressions before the paper goes to print. So even these kinds of technologies that we might not even understand so much as part of the journalistic technological framework were seen as problematic. And of course, when we moved into broadcast, the radio was seen as problematic. And of course, there's been a number of famous cases of radio content that wasn't news, like the War of the Worlds broadcast by Orson Welles in the 1930s, being mistaken for the news and causing public panic. Television, again, criticized in part also for giving more attention to the news anchor, to the journalist presenting the news broadcast and making them into a celebrity with a certain amount of power over what information audiences would trust or not. And of course, more recently, the internet, and more specifically social media. And no doubt, whatever new technologies will come along over time will be once again also criticized and adopted very reluctantly by most journalists and news outlets, except always for a handful of early adopters who become advocates, even evangelists, for these kinds of technologies. This is also a common feature, and in past weeks, you've already encountered some of those in their statements. People like J.D. Laziker, people like Dan Gilmore, people like Jay Rosen, who have early on adopted, for instance, blogging, and say, well, actually, I can do something with this that I couldn't do as just a normal journalist. I can engage with my audiences. I can seek information and knowledge from my audiences. So this can also have positive effects. But more broadly, journalists tend to be quite skeptical, and even, as you see there, tend to have quite a negative outlook on not just new technology, but really the future of their profession overall. So this is a fairly recent study, and as you see there, 46% of all journalists say they've got a negative or very negative outlook on the future of journalism. At the same time, 38 say very positive or positive. So there's a bit of a split there in the ranks as well, perhaps, about where journalism is going at this point. And again, as always, there are some technologies that tend to be singled out specifically as problems by journalists. I've talked in the past about the blog wars of the mid-2000s in Australia. This is something a little bit more recent, from 2016, when the editor of The Australian, an influential conservative newspaper in Australia, said, well, Twitter, a medium with a maximum of 140 characters, as it was then, is not conducive to logical thought, to deep research, to reflection or independence of thought. It really is a place where activists cheer each other on, often in the foulest language or with the most naive affirmations of clearly partisan positions. This is in some ways not so far removed from what we've heard about the Telegraph. It's not conducive to logical thought because it's just too fast in what it does. It's too quick in providing more and more information, and you can't really process it anymore. In some ways, this is very much the same kind of language, the same kind of rhetoric that we see here from Chris Mitchell, who is the guy, by the way, on the right here, standing next to Rupert Murdoch, who owns The Australian. So this kind of attitude that new technologies, well, they undermine what journalism really does, are still very prominent. Just to give you another flavor of this, again, he goes on about Twitter quite a bit, Chris. He says, Twitter is the worst. I would call it little more than a left-wing echo chamber for various highly politicized activists, including many journalists. This is not surprising, since it was actually invented as a way for pop stars to talk to their fans rather than to discuss serious issues, which of course is factually wrong. That's not why Twitter was invented. But let's not get the facts in the way of a good rant. And in some ways, of course, this is the pot calling the kettle black. This is the editor of itself a highly partisan newspaper critiquing the Twitter sphere for daring to have a different opinion. So this is not an unbiased participant in these debates, but someone who'd rather just like to see these things go away because they are disrupting the established model of how this particular paper, but also of how conventional journalism itself works. And that's really, I think, one of the reasons to move away from Chris Mitchell and his particular reasons for disliking Twitter. There are a number of reasons that are quite obvious for why journalists and journalism tend to be skeptical of new technologies. Well, change in itself is obviously disruptive. It means that you have to do something different from the way that you used to do it before. You have to adapt to new technologies. You have to implement them somehow into your work processes. That, of course, might create costs. You need to find ways to build technologies around these new platforms to enable your journalists to tweet or to produce content for these new platforms. That may require new business models because on many of these platforms, of course, news circulates in a way that cannot be monetized easily. So you've got to find other ways to do this. It, of course, also means that you're now engaging with new audiences that may have a different perspective on the type of journalism that you produce, and that might criticize you and question your coverage of certain events, and you can then choose to engage or not to engage with them. Of course, on these platforms too, there might be new competitors, companies that have not so far been significantly active in the news, but are now building new models of news coverage specifically for these new platforms, for the web, for social media, for particular platforms of social media. And that ultimately also creates new power structures. The newspaper or the news broadcast that used to be powerful as the voice of the nation or as the leading news medium in a particular country now is being challenged by new entrants, by born digital news outlets that might provide different kinds of news coverage and see things differently. And in some ways, we've seen this within the media, of course, early on, emerging very specifically as a response to the mainstream news industry and covering the World Trade Organization summit in a very different way from the way that established media were doing it. So that changes the structures of power within the industry, but also more broadly within the public. And of course, all of this happens again against the backdrop of an industry that is already struggling because a lot of what used to be called the rivers of gold from advertising and from classified advertising, particularly in newspapers, have moved on, and the money for advertising now flows not to news organizations, but it flows to Google and other online platforms. So the industry is struggling, and in a struggling environment, to adapt to these new technologies, embed them into your processes, is a tough ask, is a very difficult thing to do. So as also Adele have said, there is an inclination there for journalists at the leading news organizations in any nation, this is about the US, but in any nation, to simply try and maintain the status quo. the leading news outlets particularly have that position of leadership that they've established in the old environment, and of course would like to keep it. So they don't particularly like these new platforms and these new competitors coming along. And that's really what we're seeing in the statements from Chris Mitchell that I've just shown you. Now suddenly you've got all of these upstarts, these new news organizations with less reach and less influence that are trying to make themselves visible and trying to capture a greater share of the news market by engaging with and adapting to these new platforms where news circulates. So there is a very long history of some very negative perspectives about new technologies, about the internet more recently, and about social media much more recently. In fact, even in 2017, you could find a statement like this from a columnist in the New York Times: "The internet is an open sewer of untreated, unfiltered information." Now, yes, there are many problems, as we've just seen when we talked last week about mis and disinformation. So there is a lot of problematic content out there, but that's not to be equated with the overall internet. Not the internet is the problem, but the particular operators of these mis and disinformation sites. And of course, too, as we've seen last week, much of the mis and disinformation that circulates ultimately gets amplified by journalism as well, by problematic forms of entertainment, celebrity, and tabloid journalism. So this isn't simply a battle between good journalism and the bad internet, but also between good and not so good journalistic outlets who are publishing this content. But you see the strength of feeling, the depth of annoyance amongst journalists with all of these newfangled technologies coming along, even as late as 2017, because they now have to adapt their processes again to this new environment, and they'd really rather just get on with the jobs that they're already doing. So this is the really conservative nature of journalism ultimately when it comes to the technologies that it uses. But they just can't avoid that change because it's not in their power to avoid it. It's the users themselves. It's all of us. It's everyday people whose preferences for how we communicate online and how we engage with the news online are changing. So here you're seeing an older study from the mid 2000s to the early 2010s of how people engage online, how they communicate online, what they do online. And you're seeing their email was already well established from 05 to 11, nothing much changes. But you see a rapid rise in the use of social networking sites from 17% to 60%. Who are using social media, social networking sites, as they're still called at that point. Of course, Facebook itself was launched as the Facebook in 2004. Twitter was launched in 2006. Other platforms came along later. So over this time is really when social media adoption really starts to happen. You see other forms of using the internet as well for communication, posting photos, making or receiving phone calls, writing a blog, which rises from 5% to 23% in 2011, maintaining a personal website. So more and more, this is really the story of how people are moving online, are moving their communicative efforts online, including especially as the next cab of the rank after email, by engaging in social media during this time. So that's a very significant shift in how we all communicate. And of course, communicating about the news, communicating the news also is an important aspect of all of this. Yeah, that's sort of the big part, I think, that I would take away from this. From the same report too, not just us communicating, but how we look for information online also changes very significantly. In 2005, well, people were kind of using search engines or maybe even going still to specific pages, typing in the domain and going there, cnn.com, and you're there. By 2007, search engines had taken over. 2009, 2011, search engines were now responsible for about 2/3 or so of the way that we look for information. So this is also a shift away from typing URLs directly and going directly to particular sources to just searching for stuff online via Google and other search engines, and really relying ultimately on them to provide accurate and up-to-date information. And that, of course, also means that loyalty to specific websites now reduces very significantly. People are no longer simply going to CNN.com or BBC.co.uk or whatever else as they're drinking their morning coffee or whenever they're doing it. They're no longer going to that specific outlet that they've always visited. They're now entering a search term into Google and maybe asking for the news of the day or particular topics that they're interested in. And Google might respond by recommending CNN or BBC or whatever, but it might also recommend a much broader range of other outlets that are also available to audiences now. So that, again, is a significant shift in what people are looking for, how they're looking for it, and where they're likely to find it. That reduces the status of leading news outlets because the recommendations being made might now go to a much broader range of outlets. And of course, that means the traffic of actual users clicking on those links might also go to a much broader range of outlets. So that levels in some ways the playing field, at least somewhat, amongst different news outlets as well. Again, a reason for people like Chris Mitchell and others in leading news outlets in particular countries to lament their fate and lament these changes. And then finally, again, from that report, you're seeing also here, just for the BBC, how referral data, how referrals to its website from social media outlets like Facebook and Twitter have changed just over the course of January 2009 to December 2010. So really just over 2 years, we've gone from about 500,000 users coming in from Facebook to the BBC website to over 2 million, and from about 50,000 users per month coming from Twitter to the BBC website to about nearly 400,000 users. So suddenly social media platforms are becoming a significant source of traffic, of users coming in to leading news websites like the BBC as well. And that, again, is as a result of gatewatching, of news sharing, of news curation on these platforms. The links to these sites are being shared more and more on these platforms, and quite evidently more and more people are clicking on those links and then coming into the BBC site from them as well. So that's, again, a very significant shift. And of course, while this is data for the BBC, the same will be true for other platforms, for other news outlets as well. And it might not always just go to the BBC, to these leading news outlets, but it might be more widely distributed now online as well. So this is why journalists and the news industry overall simply can't ignore these platforms anymore, at least from the sort of late 2000s, early 2010s onwards. There is a need to adapt to this new reality and to try and adopt these social media platforms in some way. So who is it who's doing this? Well, it's easier for some news outlets than others to begin with. Those news outlets that are perhaps not as driven by the news market, by the advertising market, can more easily explore these new platforms. They are maybe not well resourced, but in some ways financially secure, like public service media, who are not necessarily receiving a great share of their income from advertising, but actually from taxpayers, from the government, or through license fees and so on, depending on the specific country. But they have the freedom to an extent to experiment more with these new platforms, even if there isn't any money in them, because they are a little bit isolated from the market. Other outlets like The Guardian are also in that boat to an extent. The Guardian, as you may know, is ultimately funded by income from a trust, a well-endowed financial trust that funds much of the Guardian operations. Of course, the Guardian also gets additional money from advertising and from its audiences, but it again is somewhat more isolated from the market and can experiment more, even if there's no direct money in it. Smaller outlets as well might be able to experiment more because it takes less for them to change the way that they operate. They're more agile. Perhaps the fact that they're more specialist in that they're addressing particular communities of people who are really interested in politics or the economy or sports or whatever else it might be easier to find those communities online as well and connect with them and thereby become successful in their operations as well. Journalists in particular news beats as well, in particular areas of the news, might be able to adapt more easily because social media are particularly well suited. Again, maybe think of sports journalists or economics journalists putting out, updates on the scores of particular matches or on the stock market via social media is actually quite a logical thing to do because of the speed of social media. Social media, in some ways, become the new ticker tape in that sense of rapid updates and real-time updates about what's going on in the world. Long-form journalism might have a much harder time adapting to social media spaces and their particular styles of stories. And of course, outlets that are already born into the digital age rather than being print or broadcast outlets might also find it easier to adapt to these new digital technologies. Beyond these outlets as well, it might be that independent journalists and possibly also younger and less established journalists who are not so embedded into particular newsroom structures that might be slow to change, they're the ones perhaps who can more easily adapt to these new technologies as well. They're more flexible in their own right because they're already working for themselves and are doing their own thing. So maybe it's easier for them. Maybe they also better understand these technologies because they've already grown up with them. We've used to use this term digital natives, which is quite problematic because we all have learned to use different social media platforms, and even though you were born after 2000, let's say, doesn't mean that you are immediately able to use some of the new social media technologies that are arriving every year. So while people might not be digital natives as such, the more they've grown up with digital technologies, the more they might also have an advantage over their much older colleagues in journalism who've grown up still with typewriters and dictaphones. And, to some extent, frankly, also, there are some journalist academics who've perhaps adapted to this quite quickly because they've also had the freedom perhaps to think more deeply about these technologies and think about them from a more theoretical point of view, rather than being driven always by the pressures of the journalistic job itself. So these are some of the kinds of categories of outlets and individuals who've adapted most easily, perhaps, or most quickly to these new technologies of online and social media. But often this has also been driven by really significant breakthrough moments when just something happened in a particular country, in a particular context, and a lot of journalists suddenly realized, hey, social media are really useful for this particular thing. And again, I'm going to use here an example from Australia, where in 2009, the then opposition party, the Liberal Party, went through a process of leadership uncertainty and instability. And at some point, this came to a head, and a lot of the leading team in the opposition essentially resigned from their positions in order to force the election of a new leader, a new opposition leader. And this was really the first time in 2009 when this happened during a time when quite a few journalists were experimenting with Twitter. Quite a few politicians were already active on Twitter. Other political pundits were also on Twitter. And this is what Twitter actually looked like back then, which looks quite different from what it is now. So we see one of the leading political editors saying, I've never seen anything like this in federal politics, mass resignations starting to happen amongst this opposition leadership team. But she's doing this on Twitter, and she's being retweeted by others on Twitter. So the news is coming out about these mass resignations, not in in newspapers, not in broadcast, but on Twitter, and is being covered on Twitter. And again, other journalists who are there in Canberra, in Parliament House, who are observing all of this, are reporting basically from the corridors of power, from the corridors of Parliament House, saying what's going on. There's cameras on all three doors of the then opposition leader's office, covering what's going on. They posted even some very blurry pictures of the cameras in Parliament House, standing around, all the journalists standing there waiting for something to happen, waiting for the news to unfold. And they're doing all of this for the first time on Twitter. And and journalism academics like Julie Posetti here are then saying, well, this is real-time reporting of this leadership spill, as it's called in Australia. And you see there's a hashtag, of course, for it as well, via Twitter. And this real-time reporting is altering Australian political reporting practice and is changing media management by politicians before our eyes. You see there also language, not so much the full and fully written out language of journalism, but it's kind of shorthand as well of the spill. Oz political reporting prax for practice, pollies for politicians. So this is journalistic language. This is almost internal journalistic talk saying, wow, this is all happening now, and it's everything's changing so quickly. But of course, it's happening on Twitter. So the general public that was on Twitter at this point could also observe this in much the same way. So this was a breakthrough moment in Australian politics, in Australian journalism, because it was the first leadership challenge, the first period of political instability that was really covered on Twitter first and then reported about in other media second. And gradually this led journalists themselves to realize, well, actually, this medium is good for this sort of stuff. And, coordinating this via a shared hashtag like Spill is useful as well. So this brings us back, in a sense, to what we've talked about the use of Twitter in breaking news situations. But now it's the journalistic side of this. It's not the general public following these breaking news situations, but it's the journalists adopting Twitter for this, and many journalists, in fact, joining right on this day, right at this point, in order to not be left out and in order to see what others are reporting, what's going on in Canberra. Of course, other crisis events, other acute events are pushing this as well. This is from the Australian Broadcasting Corporation in 2011, when there was a period of significant flooding all across Queensland, the state where I'm based. And what was interesting here was not so much that they provided a map. This was, in fact, still a fairly early use of Google Maps as well for mapping the flood events themselves and showing all the different aspects there, the affected rules and hazards and evacuations and so on. But what for the first time they incorporated into this as well was volunteer reporting. So reporting from ordinary people via Twitter and other social media platforms and via email and other sources as well. So user-generated content, user-generated information about what was going on the ground was also now being incorporated into journalistic coverage and journalistic reporting as well. So again, these kinds of crisis events are often breakthrough moments for journalism engaging with user-generated content, engaging with social media platforms as well. And so journalists are starting to recognize this as well. Here's a journalist, Latika Burke, who was very much covering the the spill event in Australian politics. And in reflecting on this later to Julie Posetti, she's saying, I can't tell you how many times I've heard journals admit they better get into this Twitter thing, whatever it is, that fortnight. It was the only service providing minute-by-minute updates on this very fluid situation. So suddenly journalists realize, hey, this Twitter thing, which I don't really understand, I don't quite know what it is and how I would use it, but that seems to be where all the up-to-date information is. I better get on it. I better join, I better create an account, I better follow this hashtag to see what's really going on. So this is one of those moments that really creates not just temporary but lasting change in the context of Australian journalism in this case. The same happened in other countries as well. Here's Beckett reporting essentially that news network journalism, that social media became really, really critical in the 2010 British general election as well. So again, around the same time, the spill in Australia was 2009, this election was 2010. Around this time, whatever current events were happening, they were increasingly happening also on social media, and particularly on Twitter. And so he says network journalism has arrived in this particular election, and journalists started to get on the social networks, get involved. Then also talking here, again, a journalist, Janine Gibson, talking here in Newman as well, talking about the way that they're seeing the impact now of their tweets as well, not just in their local community, but also much more globally. So she tweeted a video, which I think was from apparent police brutality at a protest, tweeting out that video and then saying, well, an hour later I looked at the retweets and I realized we had this enormous pyramid of distribution that social media users, by retweeting, by on-sharing, made this so visible. And actually looking at this not just within the UK, but from Brazil, from the US and elsewhere. And she thought this was an extraordinary thing, which it was. This is what we've heard from Papacarisi and Miraz about as crowdsourcing certain types of information to prominence. This is the news sharing and news curation that we all engage with, which made this video from the protest very, very visible again. But now it's not indie media doing it, but now it's a professional journalist actually doing this reporting and relying on the power of the network to make it really widely and globally visible, in fact. So again, journalists, by seeing this impact of what they do, are starting to see the potential benefits and the potential purposes that social media might play within their professional activities. And so what we're starting to see then also in, again, the late 2000s, early 2010s, is that more formally newsrooms are instituting new roles for engaging with social media specifically. Here's a report from 2009 about the New York Times hiring its first social media editor, Jennifer Preston, and I cite some of her statements in the book as well that you might have seen. So the Times hires her to essentially explore the use of social media in journalism, to explore what role it might play. And that's a significant, again, step for that newsroom as it tries to grapple with this new technology. Now, we're seeing a number of different terms for this. Some newsrooms call them social media reporters, social media coordinators, social media editors, social media news curators, social media evangelists even. The point of this is not so much to report about social media, but to use social media in reporting, to gather information from social media and to push social media out, to push information out via social media, and of course to encourage others to do so as well. So these are some of the roles that these sorts of social media editors, to use just one of those terms, tended to have. Reporting via social media, following social media as well to identify emerging and trending topics. So when a spill happens, or when a plane lands on the Hudson River, or when something else unforeseen happens that pops up on social media that becomes a trending topic on Twitter or elsewhere, to identify these and to alert the newsroom that something's going on that's not on the newsroom's radar yet, that needs to be covered, and needs to be covered ideally quite quickly, and probably also by sourcing information from social media to enhance the in-house news coverage. So again, the plane landing on the Hudson River, well, the image was circulating as soon as the ferries were arriving to rescue people from it. And so that's the sort of information that would be sourced, because no news photographers were on the scene yet. So all we had were images from bystanders reporting via Twitter. beyond the actual day-to-day activities as well, of course, in doing all of this and in modeling these kinds of uses, the point was also to encourage others to explore the use of social media, other staff, other newsroom staff, other journalists, other editors, other reporters, to use social media in their own practices as well. And possibly also to manage the new forms of engagement with audiences that are now possible, that were now possible, perhaps to moderate them as well, to moderate, for instance, the comment threads on newspaper websites or on Facebook pages and so on as well, to manage this kind of engagement and in fact find ways in which it could be managed, which in itself, of course, was still a very new practice at this point as well. And of course, as the tools again became better, and we've seen this already with that statement that I've quoted before, saying, well, suddenly I saw this story trend in Brazil and the US, managing and tracking the performance of stories on social media, generating the metrics from social media that show which stories are doing well and which aren't, that too became gradually a more important process, more important performance of these particular rules. And that's something I will talk about much more next week as well, of course. But, and this is Jennifer Preston herself saying this, the New York Times social media editor, the point here is also that this can't be an insulated role within the newsroom. Social media, as she says, can't belong to just one person. Ultimately, it needs to be part of everyone's job. And in fact, she goes on to say, in the end, my job is to make my job obsolete. My job is done when everyone in the newsroom uses social media in some way, in some form, depending on what their role is, when you no longer need a specific, distinct social media editor because everyone is doing it. So that is an end goal here as well. But of course, the social media editors as a transitional role are important to drive that change, to initiate that change in the first place. Okay. So gradually, this is more and more recognized as well amongst journalists. In the late 2000s, early 2010s, we see statements like this from a BBC reporter, Sylvia Costello, saying, if you haven't made it already as a journalist by now, you simply won't become a journalist anymore unless you engage with social media. You just have to be there. Whatever you think of social media, personally, you've just got to be there because it is now part of the tools of the trade. It's now becoming embedded into journalistic practices, and there's no way around it anymore. But that also means, trying to come to terms with, again, what all of this means. And Bosma and Graham here are saying that some journalists, mainly at the legacy media organizations, the ones that grew up as print or broadcast organizations, feel they should remain objective and detached on social media and not personally engage with readers and sources. That's the old model of journalism, whereas others, especially at these new born digital news outlets, feel they have to develop personal bonds on Twitter and other social media platforms to engage readers in news production, but also to become a hub in the network and then thereby attract news consumers to their work and their platforms. So there is a real argument now emerging between perhaps older and newer journalists, younger and older journalists, about whether it's just business as usual, just on a different platform, and you basically just go on social media, but all you do is report the news, or whether you also do what other social media users who don't happen to be journalists are doing, which is to engage at a more interpersonal level and actually show a little bit of their own personal identities rather than just represent the news outlet. And that is still an ongoing struggle in many ways. How professional or how personal should you be as a journalist as you engage with social media? In fact, to address some of these challenges and just to generally provide guidelines to journalists who are now exploring these new platforms, Twitter, for instance, started to publish in the late 2000s a resource called Twitter for Newsrooms, which provides, I guess, some tools and some strategies for using this new medium, for becoming familiar with this new medium in journalistic practice. Now, this no longer exists actually, and that's perhaps a sign that Twitter and other social media platforms have now been thoroughly embedded into everyday journalistic practice. But at that point, it was very much a training resource to try and help journalists come to terms. And in fact, maybe in a somewhat patronizing way, but certainly Twitter is acknowledging this and saying, well, we know you all come from different generations. Some are native to the Pilcrow, whatever that is, an old journalistic tool, others to the hashtag. You began your careers in different media, radio, print, broadcast, online, and mobile. But you share a common bond, the desire to make a difference in the world, bringing reliable information to the communities you serve. So, in other words, let us help you embed Twitter into these processes, into this desire, into these practices. That's what they were trying to do with this, and that's really Twitter recognizing the role that it now plays within news reporting as well, of course. So, what are some of these new practices then that emerge? I go through them in the book in some detail, but let me just give you a quick rundown of what journalists actually came to do on social media. What were their key practices? Well, the obvious one is, of course, to promote their own stories. Whenever they publish something or their news organization published something, to post a link to that story so people could go there, so readers could click on it and actually go to the website. And, we've seen with the stats I showed early on how much, even just over the course of 2009 and 2010, the traffic to the BBC, for instance, from Facebook and Twitter grew. And that's partly because journalists were starting to promote these stories. Of course, part of that is also really news curation, but now done not by ordinary social media users, but by journalists themselves. So pulling together perhaps the different stories on their outlet, maybe also on other outlets that covered a particular current event or current breaking news story, pulling together all of this material in their Twitter feed or their Facebook feed for readers to see. Part of that, in some ways, is also personal branding, positioning yourself as a journalist as a source of quality information, making sure that people follow you on social media platforms so that any future updates that you might post reach a larger and larger audience. That's the sort of public-facing aspect of what they do. Beyond that, there may also be more connection with the sources, the politicians, the experts, the activists, and others that might ultimately appear in news stories. So using this in a sense too as an information detection tool and as a tool for two-way communication with sources to clarify certain points, even to conduct essentially interviews via social media. So this is more of a research tool in some ways for journalists, and really more broadly also monitoring developments. And again, we've seen this with the spill hashtag that I talked about in Australia, monitoring what's going on in this particular political crisis by following the hashtag and following what all the other journalists are posting as well, and what, of course, politicians and other sources are posting about what's going on as well. That also becomes possible. The more, of course, everyone else is on social media as well and is posting updates there too. So this, in some ways, is journalists doing gate watching, journalists following the gates of other news outlets, of other journalists, of other institutions and individuals to see what they're posting and incorporating that perhaps into news stories. And then more broadly also, of course, engaging with the audience overall, exploring what audiences have to say, engaging perhaps with criticism at times, or additional information that audiences might provide. And that's, again, this idea of readers knowing more than the journalist about certain topics. So using social media perhaps as a way of capturing the voice of the people, vox pops as well. To give you an example of what that looks like even today in practice, I thought I'd just look at a New York Times journalist who became very prominent for particularly reporting on the Trump presidency. But I've just picked out, just over the last couple of weeks or so, some of her tweets. So this is Maggie Haberman from the New York Times. Some of her tweets represent these kinds of practices. So promoting stories. Here she is promoting a new news story about the Ukraine war and the UN's efforts in brokering a peace deal. What's interesting here is that she's actually promoting a story not from her own platform, not from the New York Times, but from CBS News. So that's a bit of solidarity almost between journalists working for potentially rival news agencies, news outlets. But of course, in doing so, she's also positioning herself as a news source on Twitter, independent of the company that she happens to be employed for herself. So that's promoting stories. Curating content, again, this is pulling in stories here from another journalist, from Carl Cheney, about the Trump team's various legal issues, and then commenting on that herself. So this is her curating content by adding additional background information on this particular story that isn't in the original story by Kyle Cheney. So that's really, again, positioning herself as a source of information, of course. And if you wanted to follow this particular story, then you could follow Carl Cheney and get the original story. But of course, you could follow Maggie Haberman as well and get the original story plus her commenting on that. Personal branding, well, this is actually her promoting her book about the Trump presidency. So in some ways, this goes beyond the journalistic world itself and towards the world of the pundit and the book author, of course, in this particular case. So this is establishing herself not just as a journalist, but as a long-form observer of American politics as well. And that's, of course, personal branding, not just to position yourself, but really to ultimately make a profit, to ultimately sell the book as well. Connecting with sources, well, I don't have many examples of this, so I'm just showing you the message button, because a lot of that connecting with sources for someone in this position would, of course, happen via direct messages that aren't public, rather than via messaging in public on Twitter or elsewhere. So but you can be absolutely sure that this kind of direct messaging with sources is happening for her and for many other journalists who are active on social media as well. Monitoring developments, well, this is again her just retweeting another journalist's post saying, well, this hearing is about to begin. So that's basically her monitoring what's going to happen at that hearing and letting her audiences know about it as well. And finally, engaging with audiences. This is a bit of a longer thread there, but essentially a thread responding to someone who had criticized her coverage. And then you see a conversation first by her followers with this person saying, well, actually, you should have read it in detail, and the person acknowledging, well, actually, I should have read the piece before commenting. It's actually a much better piece than I thought it was. And then finally, she gets involved and says, well, thank you for the apology. So this is engaging with audiences, in this case, in a somewhat self-serving way, saying, well, I was right all along and you were wrong, so thank you for that. But it is one example of engaging with the audience here. In fact, with someone who had criticized her, then retracted that criticism. So that's a form of really direct public engagement with audiences as well. So even just within this one journalist, we've now seen all of these types of engagement that might exist. And of course, journalists will find other ways perhaps to use these platforms over time as well. Now, in all of this, of course, there are potential problems as well. Placing yourself so visibly on social media has consequences, both good and bad for the individual journalist, but possibly more bad than good for the general public. To some extent, there is maybe a rich get richer phenomenon here, that the leading outlets, the leading journalists might become the leaders of the online and social media space as well, that people like Maggie Haberman, by virtue of working for the New York Times, will get a bigger platform than some journalists working for a local newspaper somewhere. So it might actually in some ways narrow the range of content that we end up seeing, or that we end up following for that matter, as ordinary users, because we end up still following the same elite journalists and elite outlets more than anything else. That may not necessarily be the case, but that's certainly a potential problem that might exist. Also, as journalists engage with others, as they follow others, as they report perhaps about trending topics, they might just follow the loudest voices and react to the most highly trending topics of the day. So they might pay attention particularly to the Twitterati, the kind of elite on Twitter, the most active users of Twitter, but that group might not be representative for the general public, almost certainly isn't representative for the general public. So by paying attention only to the loudest voices on Twitter, journalists might actually be misled to into thinking that particular topics that are really visible on Twitter are actually really important to the general public as well. The focus on Twitter that we see actually with a lot of this as well, journalists adopted Twitter much more than other social media platforms, particularly early on, also means that there is something of a demographic imbalance. Twitter is not representative, again, for the general public. Its demographics are not representative for the general public in any country where it operates. And so what journalists might see on Twitter is just the type of people who are active on Twitter, not others who are not, who for whatever reason prefer other social media platforms or are just not active on social media platforms at all. So if as a journalist I'm reporting only about what's going on Twitter, then again I'm getting a very skewed worldview ultimately out of this as well. Flipping this around too, of course, journalists themselves might have wanted to adopt social media, but we also know now from a decade of experience that there are particular groups of journalists who are especially much subjected to attacks from the general crowd on social media platforms. And these are particularly women and minority journalists. So there is frankly a lot of discrimination on social media as well, directed at journalists. And if you are a woman journalist, if you are a minority journalist, you might bear the brunt of that kind of attack, of course. That might, of course, ultimately also lead you to silence your own voice again on social media. You may not be as active on these platforms if you fear being attacked all the time. You might also be worried about making mistakes, providing the wrong information, just expressing yourself in the wrong way, maybe voicing what seem to be unpopular opinions. So again, we might have a spiral of silence kind of effect here that leads to journalists actually not reporting even-handedly about certain topics anymore, but reporting in a way that they expect will do well on social media. And this ultimately also is a question for the news outlets themselves. What kind of activity would they like to see from their journalists? What level, for instance, of personal opinion are they comfortable with? To what extent are journalists, because they're using social media as themselves and not necessarily as the news outlet that they're working for, to what extent are they free to express their own their own personal opinion about what's going on in the world, rather than just tread the line that's set by the editorial direction of the news outlet that they're working for. And of course, in all of this, then there's also additional pressure now heaped upon the journalist, not just to write good stories, but to have these stories become really visible and circulate as widely as possible on social media platforms. So to generate strong social media metrics. And that, again, is something that we'll talk about more next week when we talk about the news industry's response, which is very much metrics driven, of course, as well. So in all of this, by being active as individual journalists on social media, of course, journalists simply reveal more of themselves and make themselves perhaps more vulnerable to attack in the process as well from the general crowd on social media platforms. And so Ulrike Hedman, for instance, then asks, well, does journalism now include not only the content of the journalistic process, but also the journalist herself or himself? And that, of course, again, the herself is well chosen here because that, again, might be a problem, particularly for women and minority journalists who we know get attacked much more on social media platforms than men. This is tricky for new journalists, for young journalists who want to establish themselves. They may either have to live with the abuse, or they may just not be able to use social media to its full potential. And that, of course, undermines perhaps their ability to progress in the news industry for themselves as well. All right. So in some ways, and I describe this in the book by using the term disclosure transparency, this really puts journalists much more amongst the general public, amongst the people. It makes the backstage of the journalistic process much more visible. The backstage here means the way that journalists are sourcing information, processing information, writing their stories, putting out their stories, because when you're on Twitter and you're seeing journalists kind of just picking up on information that they see circulating elsewhere, that's really still the news gathering process that you're seeing. When they're retweeting other people's content, then you see what they're drawing on. When they're engaging with news sources, perhaps publicly as well, you see how they're engaging with them. So a lot more of the journalistic research process and journalistic opinion formation process becomes visible and becomes also, of course, again, open to criticism perhaps from the general public. To some extent also, as journalists engage publicly with each other on these platforms, it might expose a kind of journalistic groupthink amongst them as they talk amongst themselves in a public way on Twitter, for instance, and as they all agree with each other that a government should take certain steps or should make certain decisions, it shows that perhaps there isn't a great deal of diversity in how they think about the world, even if they're working for different and rival news outlets. And so the journalistic processes of individual journalists as well as of these journalistic groups are more exposed to open scrutiny by just being more visible in public, and therefore also perhaps inviting more commentary and criticism from the general public that ultimately requires a response from these journalists as well. Just to give you an example of this is from recent weeks after the death of Queen Elizabeth. Again, an example from Australia, where Australian media, of course, reported in detail about the Queen's death and about the aftermath and about the burial ceremonies and all of this. And because Australia is still a monarchy and the Queen is still the head of state, or was still the head of state of the country, of course, this triggered debates about whether Australia should become a republic with its own head of state, rather than having the British monarch be the head of state by default. And as you see here, this is a random person essentially saying, well, the death of the Queen would have been an opportunity to present the different views on the monarchy, on British history and colonialism, even on the question of whether Australia should become a republic. Instead, we endured days of mawkish, fawning, gossip mag, sentimentality, and not balance. And you see there, this is then hashtagged with the term, "This is not journalism. This is simply court reporting." So this is a common hashtag that now appears whenever people are criticizing journalistic coverage. This is not journalism. You're not doing it right, essentially. We should have had much more balanced, much more diverse coverage of whatever the event might be. So again, this is quite a common practice now that we see. And of course, this ultimately is a threat to journalistic authority and objectivity. It's something that certainly very much rankles and annoys journalists for being criticized in this way. And it also enables, of course, political actors to criticize journalism and perhaps to try and get away with not exposing themselves anymore to journalistic scrutiny by saying, well, they're not doing journalism right anymore anyway, so why should I subject myself to being interviewed? I'm just going to post my views and my ideas directly on social media to reach my audience, my followers, my voters directly. And this ultimately, again, is a challenge to journalism in that it undermines this kind of journalistic authority and objectivity. And again, in the book, I go into some details and some examples of that. We've had, of course, a number of political leaders, Geert Wilders in the Netherlands, Donald Trump in the US, Narendra Modi in India, who very rarely actually provide interviews, choose to give interviews where journalists might ask critical questions. Rather, they stage rallies and they are active on social media where they post their views or where they provide their views directly to the public. And all that journalism is able to do is to choose to report about this or not. And as we've seen with Donald Trump, for instance, every time he tweeted, as president, when he was still able to tweet, that became an instant news story. It was instantly reported in the mainstream news because he wasn't available to be interviewed, of course, directly and to be asked critical questions by journalists. And that extended even to mistweets like the famous Kofifi tweet, of course, that he posted at some point. So this is overall the way that journalists respond and react and engage with these new fangled social media technologies. What we'll look at next time is the other side of the coin, the way that the news industry engages with social media from a management perspective and from the perspective of generating more and more metrics for how well or how poorly its content is doing on social media platforms. So that's next week. For that, please read chapter 6 of the book, which covers this in some detail. Thank you all and see you then.